Today in Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Secret Agent, an Apogee platformer which, believe it or not, I never played as a kid. I'm not entirely certain what was going on with this, but for whatever reason, this was a game no one ever really talked about when I was growing up. I never saw it on download sites or in shareware compilations, never saw screenshots of it. At best, I vaguely knew it existed, but nothing much more than that, so I just thought it was going to be some sort of spy game and nothing I'd be too interested in. Well, having finally played it, I have to... Okay, seriously, why am I not able to get past this part? I had no trouble with this during testing, and now that I'm all set up to play this game optimally, I keep dying here. Yeah, so it turns out this game has some bugs and some oversights, along with some other oddities which can make it difficult to play if you don't know what's going on. Now, this was a very early Apogee title, riding on the heels of Crystal Caves, and sharing a lot in common with that particular game, which I'll probably cover on the show one of these days, but the point is that there's a lot going on here which makes the game hard to approach for new players, despite how simple the game really is. Not to mention, this is an early example of blatant false advertising with shareware, as the ordering info says that the later episodes have all new dangers and challenges, when in fact, all 3 episodes, both the shareware and 2 commercial episodes, all have the exact same dangers and challenges, just different level layouts. So yeah, it's not that the game's bad, it's just easily forgettable. Secret Agent was developed and released by Apogee in 1992 and is a one-player platformer with support for EGA 320x216 color graphics and PC speaker sound effects. As for its current release date, it's still shareware and can be purchased as a digital download directly from the 3D Realms website at 3drealms.com or from Steam or GOG. It's $5 both direct from 3D Realms and on Steam, or $6 if you buy it from GOG. As for physical copies, since it was only distributed through mail order, it's going to be nearly impossible to find one. But be very careful if you do go searching, because I've noticed a trend starting to crop up where a few unscrupulous sellers will try to resell digital download keys for exorbitant prices. So be careful of that in your searches. Going to skip on having a story section because the story for the game is incredibly simple. An organization known as the Diabolical Villain Society, or DVS for short, has stolen the blueprints for a secret project known as Red Rock Rover, an orbiting satellite able to pinpoint and destroy any target on the face of the planet using a Ruby-powered laser. How such a thing got developed without sparking World War III is anyone's guess. But in any case, you play the role of Secret Agent 006½, who's been tasked to recover these blueprints and stop the DVS from gaining control of the satellite. Pretty straightforward, although despite the simplicity of the story, there's a typo in it in the final episode. Whoops. In any case, the gameplay is just as straightforward as the story, and each of the 3 episodes play pretty much the exact same. You start each on a world map with immediate access to 15 different levels, with the final 16th level locked off until you clear the others. And this means you can play most of the levels in any order you want, which is handy in case a particular level is giving you a bunch of trouble, as you can just abandon it and come back to it later. This world map, though, highlights how we're going to be running into some minor yet extremely weird issues going forwards. For instance, you can walk along the north, east, and west edges of the beaches just fine, but not the south beaches. Apparently, south-facing beaches in this game are the equivalent of brick walls. And when you enter a level, you have 2 objectives which must be completed. The first is to destroy a radar dish. The second is to find some dynamite to blow open the exit in order to escape after the radar dish is destroyed. And most every level also has various kinds of keys to worry about for opening locked doors, a floppy disk to find, which you need to use with a special computer to disable a laser barrier, and sometimes you also have to worry about invisible platforms, pushable barrels, and various kinds of enemies. Now, for as buggy and nonsensical as some of this is going to get, the game does do a few neat things. For starters, you have limited ammunition which translates between each level, so the game encourages you to only use your gun when you absolutely need to, and to aim carefully so that you don't waste any ammo. Although, truth be told, if you pick up every piece of ammo along the way, you're probably going to hit the ammo limit well before you reach the end of the game, so you don't have to be too cautious of conserving ammo, just a little cautious. Another thing that's extremely well done are the pushable barrels. If you push one into a solid wall for a moment, it'll pop out from the wall and place the player on the other side, allowing them to push the barrel the other way. While many of the levels are designed with this mechanic in mind, it also makes it possible to recover from some mistakes, provided you haven't pushed the barrel down to an area it's not supposed to be in. There's also a permanent power-up you can find hidden in each episode, which makes it possible to have 2 shots on the screen at once from your gun, instead of just 1 shot. Now, quite frankly, limiting how many shots can be in the air at a time has always been a game mechanic which has bugged me. It's definitely more of a consideration on older hardware where sprite counts are limited per scan line, but that's the only real excuse. But, okay, the Atari 2600 also has the excuse of having only 128 bytes of RAM, but 80s DOS PCs generally range between 256 kilobytes and 640 kilobytes of RAM, and they don't have any sprite considerations to worry about, so there's no hardware excuse to arbitrarily limit the number of shots the player can fire. That said, though, having a power-up which you keep forever in a non-linear game is a really neat thing, and I kind of wish they had more such power-ups here, like maybe special armor which protects you from landmines, or a health power-up to increase your maximum health. But alas, the gun is the only such power-up you can find. Actually, let's talk about some of the more unusual, but not necessarily bad things about the game, such as that health bar in the bottom corner, or rather, health heads. You have 3 health units every time you enter a level. If you take a hit, you lose a unit of health, and if you lose all 3 units of health, you die and restart the level. The mechanic isn't even remotely weird, but rather, it's weird that it's represented as heads instead of as a health bar. Almost as though the game originally had one-hit deaths and extra lives, but was changed at the last minute due to the level of difficulty. Because the game does get pretty hard at some points, and I can't imagine trying to beat this thing without being allowed to take any hits. Another odd but not necessarily bad thing are the guard enemies. Not the robots, as there's a variety of these and they all fill their roles pretty well. But there's 5 different kinds of guard enemies: regular guards, sentries, ninjas, ninja masters, and thugs. What's weird about these is that even though they all behave slightly differently, they're technically all part of the same health bar. What I mean is that if you shoot a thug, which is the hardest of the bunch and capable of shooting back at you, it becomes a ninja master, which can still shoot. Now, if you hit the ninja master, it turns into a plain old ninja, which gets rid of its attack but makes it move a lot faster. Shooting a ninja turns it into a sentry and slows it down. Shooting a sentry turns it into a regular guard and slows it down even more. And shooting a guard turns it into a gravestone, which you can then collect or shoot for additional bonus points. Yeah, it's almost as though your gun isn't really firing bullets, but rather anti-training rounds, able to remove knowledge and skill from the enemies, making them stupider with each shot until they get so stupid they just collapse and die. I mean, it's really the only explanation that makes sense. And I mean, come on, you're playing a spy, so why wouldn't he be armed with some creative weaponry like that? Actually, speaking of Agent 006.5, I find it amusing that he looks just like the thugs you come across. Oh, maybe 006.5 is actually a double agent. Actually, that makes even less sense, so never mind. The last weird but not really bad things are the invisible platforms. Now, you make these appear by picking up a special pair of glasses to wear in any level where these platforms are present. Although this seems normal enough, what's odd is that the invisible platforms do not function if you can't see them. So it's as if wearing the glasses is what actually materializes them into existence. And personally, I think it would have been way more interesting if you could still jump on the invisible platforms without having the glasses. But that's not what we're working with here. Though I find the placement of these invisible platforms can be a little odd themselves, such as right here where they show up right underneath a cloud, even though the clouds are perfectly solid and you can walk on them. Anyone else ever notice that game clouds are solid like 9 times out of 10? I mean, if these were real clouds, the player would just go whoosh, splat, dead. But now we need to talk about some of the game's more insipid issues. We'll cover the more minor things first, then we'll move on to the one major failing of the game. But let's start with the controls. Now don't get me wrong, the keyboard controls are responsive and they work as well as one would expect. The problem is the joystick controls. There's actually a couple problems with them. Firstly, there's a special question mark item in the game which, upon first glance, you're going to think is a power-up of some kind, but it's actually a power down as it confuses your character and reverses the left and right controls. On the keyboard. It has 0 effect on the joystick controls, so if you're playing with a joystick, these confusers are not going to have any effect on you. Sounds good, right? Well, not so fast. How would you like not being able to jump off of movable objects properly? Yeah, that's what I thought. Jumping from solid level geometry works fine, but when you attempt to use the joystick controls to jump off of any object which can be moved or moves on its own accord, if you attempt to push left or right before the jump is initiated, the jump never initiates. You'll just walk right off of whatever you were standing on, likely to your doom. And this isn't a delay in the controls either. The joystick controls do not suffer from any delays at all. Moving left or right on a movable object locks out the joystick jumping controls for whatever reason. So you either have to jump first and definitely be in a jump before you can move left or right, or use the keyboard. It's so bad that I actually recommend skipping on the game's internal joystick support if you want to use a joystick or gamepad with DOSBox, and just use the keymapper to remap your joystick or gamepad to the game's keyboard controls. Well, sure, the confuser items will affect you, but oh well, that's how the game's supposed to play. The other minor quirk is actually a failing of the UI design. Now, occasionally there may be circumstances where you'll want to back out of a level and return to the world map. Now to do this, you have to bring up the quit window where you have 3 different options, and if you accidentally push D or T instead of I, you will lose all of your progress since your last save. There is no confirmation box to ask if you're sure about what you're doing. And one of the key aspects of good UI design is preventing the user from making an unrecoverable decision without properly screening that decision to ensure that they actually wanted to make it. There's 2 ways this could have been done, either by making it so that quitting to DOS or the title screen would bring up a warning about losing unsaved progress and asking whether to really do it or not, or the more pertinent solution, given the major issue of this game, would have been to have a key to retry the level, thus negating the need to use the potentially progress-destroying quit menu to just replay a stage. Which, speaking of... yeah, we need to talk about this game's #1 major issue, and that's the level design as a whole. I will say, about a quarter of the levels are perfectly fine, or only have 1 or 2 minor quirks. Plus, the levels are fairly small, so it's virtually impossible to get lost. But the majority of the levels feel more like tests of patience than tests of skill. Let's start by focusing on a particular quirk of the game engine. The player plays as a character which is only 1 block tall, while the game features plenty of 1 block tall gaps to try and fit into. As long as you've got a wall to rub up against, jumping into the 1 block tall gaps is pretty easy. But when you try to do this from a distance, your natural instincts will cause you to only land the jump maybe 1 out of every 4 or 5 attempts. What's going on is that when the player hits a solid wall, they lose all of their momentum. However, if they continue to push against the wall, it'll ultimately let them move an extra couple pixels into it after a split second. Once you know this is happening, it actually becomes much easier to deal with the 1 block tall gaps, because you realize that in order to get into them, you need to have that extra push into the walls, which requires you to be up against a solid wall as fast as possible, so that you can get that extra push in before you pass the 1 block tall gap. Because if you don't get that extra push, you ain't getting in that gap. The trouble, though, is that this really does go against typical jumping considerations in games. Well, not just having to intentionally miss these jumps to actually make them a split second later, but also the fact that they exist in the first place, and that many of the levels require you to jump into them to make progress. Forcing the player to jump into a gap that's barely any bigger than they are, and insta-killing them if they fail, is not good level design, and it's amazing how many games, both good and bad, are guilty of this. The other major failing of the level design is the lack of being able to jump down. And in quite a number of platformers, the character will have the ability to jump down through a platform that they were able to jump up through by holding down and pressing the jump button. Now, there's plenty of platformers you can't do this in, which play perfectly fine, but that's because they have plenty of open space, so it's never an issue. Here in Secret Agent, multiple levels will punish you for jumping into places you're not ready to go to because you don't have a key or something, and they'll literally trap you, unable to progress or even kill yourself, forcing you to quit out of the level entirely in order to retry it. And most of the time when this happens, it could have been prevented simply by having the ability to jump down. Now, you might argue that jumping down in games would have been a relatively new concept or not really on the minds of the developers, to which I would counter that Contra came out on the NES 4 years prior and is probably the most famous example of having the ability to jump down. So that's not a good excuse. Plus, even if the devs didn't want to make jumping down a thing, they could have identified these spots where the player could get trapped during testing and altered the levels to make it possible to escape from said traps. I do get that the game has some semblance of puzzle solving going on in terms of the level progression, but some of the places that can trap you will do so before you even have a chance to realize it's a trap. So that stops being puzzle solving and now becomes trial and error, which is way more frustrating and way less satisfying to overcome. Overall, I don't like Secret Agent. Its combination of weird gameplay quirks, below average level design, and having little in the way of variety over the course of 48 levels makes me want to be playing almost any other Apogee platformer. But I do recognize that the game's not terrible, and it still served as a stepping stone for Apogee as they developed more and more titles. Mind you, I also don't like how the game tries to play itself off as having more features in the full version despite having absolutely nothing new other than more levels, like not even new graphics. I would say, for those of you who've never played this game before, go give the free shareware version a shot first, and if you enjoy that and want more, then pay the $5 or $6 for the full game. I mean, really, that's how shareware's supposed to work anyways. This really is a game where it's going to depend on the individual as to whether they like it or not, since it very precariously rides that line between being an enjoyable experience versus a frustrating one. Although the game plays fine with the auto or max cyclist settings, some of the transitions will run too slow or too fast depending. I found the best balance between screen transition speed and loading times was a fixed cycles count of 10,000. And again, do not use the game's built-in joystick support. Use the DOSBox keymapper to remap your desired joystick or gamepad to use the game's keyboard controls. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 228 is going to be on Saturday, February 3rd, and we're going to be taking a look at a game which has surprisingly little to do with dragons. And if you think you know what game that could be, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned because there's plenty more DOS games to get to. Thanks for watching, everyone, and special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's a small random set of you guys.